we first started talking about. Oh, there we go. I'll wait for the no, giving people still coming in, right, Alyssa? So we'll give them another minute or two just to make sure folks are in. And then we'll do all the stuff, housekeeping and all that too. But of course, all this stuff is available afterwards. We'll do follow-up emails. Yeah, folks are still coming in. Give them another minute. There you go. If folks want to introduce themselves, feel free to do that in the chat bot. You can sort of let folks know you're here. If you want to say hello and who you are, just do that in the chat box. Alyssa or Nicole will be tracking that as well. And so you can put questions there too, and they can field those. I'll also hopefully there'll be time. If something really pressing, if I'm not clear or something I say doesn't make any sense, please do feel free to put a hand up. I think we'll see it if a hand goes up. And so I'm happy to try and respond and clarify stuff as we get going so that we don't get too far ahead of folks without laying it out. Mallory and I have done this a couple of times. And so most of it's me, unfortunately for you guys. You're going to get more of me than you're going to get of Mallory. But this is a project that we've been working on, as I mentioned, with Philanthropy Southwest for about 3 years. This is the sort of second iteration of the project. So you've got with you today Will Brown here. I'm a professor at the Bush School of Government and Public Service. I also serve as the director of the Center for Nonprofits and Philanthropy. And then Mallory, I'll let you introduce yourself, and then I'll click you to this next slide so you can tell folks a little bit about Philanthropy Southwest.
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Mallory. I'm the Executive Vice President at Philanthropy Southwest. I see a lot of our PSW members are joining. And what else? I'm going to give a little bit of an intro about Philanthropy Southwest if you haven't heard about us before. So, of course, I'll start with our vision, mission, and value. I don't want to read everything to you because I know that you can see the screen and read very well, but PSW is a 76-year-old organization. We're actually classified as a PSO, which is a philanthropy serving organization. And so what that means is our members are funders. We like to think that we are the infrastructure of philanthropy in the Southwest region. We represent 7 states. So that's Colorado, New Mexico, Nevada, Arizona, Oklahoma, Texas, and Arkansas. And all of our members are funders of some sort, whether they're community foundation members or private family foundation members, health foundation members. They all support their community and impact their community through funding. And so we provide resources to our members. So if you want to go to the next slide, we've been in the process of a strategic plan review and edit, like most organizations. We started one at the beginning of 2020, and that quickly went out the door with everything else that was happening in 2020. So we reignited that this year by talking to our members and finding out what makes engagement with PSW important to them. Why is it that they continue to stick with us and renew? And what we heard from our members was PSW is a place for meaningful relationships, for ideas and innovation, and for professional and sector growth. And we're really grateful for this partnership with Texas A&M because they fill both the ideas and innovation pillar and the professional and sector growth pillar. So PSW is very open as an organization to coming up with new partnerships that might advance the sector in any way possible. This research on socioeconomic data is one of those. And it was our first try at something like this. And we're very happy that it worked out well with Dr. Brown and Texas A&M. We're also very grateful to PNC Institutional Asset Management for funding this study and supporting our ability to do that. And so if you are a PSW member, I just want to put up an important date for you and then also some other resources. And if you aren't, it may be something that you want to consider. We are starting a Community and Health Foundations convening. It will be in February of next year. Our save the date and website registration will go up very soon. So if you're a community or a health foundation in our region and you're looking for a place to send staff for learning and engagement, that's what this event will be. It'll be in Dallas. It'll be cost effective. We heard from a lot of community foundation members that even though we have a 76-year-old annual conference that we host every October, it's difficult to send other positions to that conference. Usually the CEO or trustee will attend. And so this is our answer to that feedback, that we can offer education opportunities for program officers and CFOs and grant makers within the community and health foundation space. If you haven't visited our learning library on the PSW website, I'd also like to make a little plug for that. Some of the resources are locked for members and some of the resources are open. So please visit and see if there's something that you are interested in learning more about. Our Southwest Regional Giving Dashboard, which is what this study is based off of, is also available on the PSW website. And then Professional Exchange Forums is a new event-based program that we're doing throughout next year for basically just Zoom communities for members within their professional verticals. So we'll bring together foundation leaders, program staff, finance officers, grant officers to get together quarterly just over Zoom for a conversation about what trouble they're having, what they could do to increase something, just a space for people to talk to other people in their same field. So if you are a PSW member and you haven't taken advantage of all of these things, please do. And if you're not a PSW member and you're interested in taking advantage of these things, please let us know and we'd love to help you. Now I'll turn it over to Dr. Brown.
Thanks, Mallory. Thanks, Dr. Driggers. I appreciate it. Center for Nonprofits and Philanthropy has been, as part of the Bush School, has been in existence since 2017. We think about our work across these three areas where we're helping people get preparing leaders through our educational initiatives, both continuing education and graduate and academic education. We do a variety of work around strengthening organizations and systems. So some of this work is working with Philanthropy Southwest fits into our thinking about how do we help networks and groups. And then, of course, our research portfolio around understanding and scholarship. And so this, of course, is square within that area of work that we're trying to do. So this is what we'll do today. We'll give you just a little bit of background about where this came about. Mallory, I might call on you too about the research questions and sort of give people just a little bit of color about why we asked these questions and the way we did. I'll get into the data and try and give you a sense of what we did, what we looked at, and what it took to try and be able to make these estimates that we have here in regards to the economic impact of philanthropic giving. And then we'll go through some selected findings. We'll look at it at a region, the 7 states that Mallory just referenced. We'll take a look at the nature of grant recipients, which are basically nonprofit organizations and the way that they operate, in particular the way they spend the money. And then the bulk of what we'll be sharing with you are the economic impact estimates. And we'll do it both for the region, the 7 states, and we'll unpack it for each one of the states. So if folks are from some of the other representative states, you can see some different patterns of what's going on. Just a brief reference. Mallory made reference to our sponsor, PNC, Institutional Asset Management. It did make a big difference because when we first started having these conversations, it wasn't quite clear how we could pay to be able to get something like this done. And they really stepped up and made a big difference for us to be able. So they've been a real good partner for us. Do also want to acknowledge the work of the graduate students from last year. A dedicated team of 6 of those folks really took to this data and really helped clean it up, prepare it, gather it. There was some primary data collection as well as a lot of preparation to be able to make sense of all of this. And they did really the bulk. So both Mallory and I got a chance to work with them over that 9-month period. And so they really made a big difference and produced a lot of good material for this. I didn't get a chance to see if any of them jumped on. It would have been kind of fun if a couple of them, we could have called on Erin and made her talk to everybody. But yeah, several of these folks were really key and instrumental in that work, and so I do want to acknowledge it. This is the way the way we had refined and talked about the questions for the capstone group in some ways, is we did want to understand the economic impact of philanthropy in the Southwest region, and how is it different between states and subregions, and then what are the characteristics of grant recipients. But Mallory, you mind just giving a moment on the motivations for why is it that this was our question, and maybe even the broader questions that we were thinking about?
Sure. This became really important to Philanthropy Southwest, specifically after coming out of COVID. You may be familiar with the Foundations on the Hill event, where foundations from all over go to Washington, D.C. to talk to policymakers about the charitable sector, about advocate for decisions that will help us do more in our communities, right? And so we realized when we were preparing for that event that what we really needed was some concrete data to put in front of policymakers, instead of saying things like, foundations impact the communities where we all live. They make things better. They make pretty houses. They make great playgrounds. They make great things. We really need them in our communities. We wanted some actual numbers for a policymaker, a decision maker in Washington, D.C., to be able to look at and say, if I vote against this, or if I make this decision, it will affect foundations in the area that I serve. So that was really our catalyst for making sure that we could come up with a research study that would provide our members and other funders in the region the data needed to have these important conversations at the legislative level. Since then, we started with summary data across the whole region, and then we learned how important it would be to break that down to sub-region, to state, to regions within each state. As you can imagine, the 7 states that Philanthropy Southwest serves are incredibly different. If you think of rural Colorado and North Texas, right, it's all going to be really, really different in terms of the communities that you serve. So once we were able to get the regional summary data through the process with Dr. Brown and the students, we said, okay, let's get more specific and deep dive into each part of the states that we serve. So we're really proud with how this turned out and how the questions led us to this deeper dive of topics.
Yeah, and thank you, Mallory. That summarizes. Let me take I won't try to get too wonky here, but I'll give you just a little bit of what we did, and give you just a sense of what we were thinking about. So we started with the grants data, so you can get from Candid. We'll give you a sample of allocation patterns of philanthropic actors within the region. So we set it up by saying, okay, we're talking about the 7-state region. Give us some of the grants that were allocated in those regions, give us a good sample. And of course, we had to do it then by the state, the different subregions that we had identified at the time. We also did some work with different priority areas and then types of foundations, but I'm not going to present all of that. So we ended up with almost 16,000 records of unique grant data information. And it had quite a bit of information about the funder themselves, the nature of who they were, and they had, but that in this instance, they're located in the Southwest region. And then the second thing we needed to be able to know was who gets the money, where does it go? So within that grants data, it tells us the area of interest to of the grant. It's targeted toward arts, it's targeted toward education, etc. Then we needed to know, well, where does that money go? Where does it lands in a nonprofit organization, and what are the implications of that? And so we needed to try and get some better data on that. Was the work that the students spent quite a bit of time going out and grabbing actually unique data and getting 1,500 records of grant recipients to be able to make estimates about their expense patterns, how much they spend on salaries, how much they spend on program, how much they spend on administration, and those kinds of things. So those are the 2 main data sets that we have to be able to do some of this. And again, I don't want to try and get too complicated for folks, but the general principle here is that you've got this initial, I'm going to use my little, I do like my pointer. You've got this direct effects, which is basically the grants that are given. So you've got a certain amount of money that are given out by these foundations across the Southwest. And then that money gets directed toward nonprofit organizations, and they typically spend that money on purchases or disbursements or programs, activities. We'll see that they spend most of it on programs, but they also spend quite a bit of money on people and wages. Those purchases and wages have some induced or secondary effects or even tertiary effects. And the software program that we were able to use is able to take those estimates. So what we did is we built in estimates around these things here. Here's roughly how much money goes toward purchasing these things, how much goes to wages, and then the magic box of the software allows us to be able to make those secondary and tertiary estimates to give us the total effect, the economic impact. And it's a good number. It's one that makes sense to people. You can interpret it and provide some clarity. So, and just a little bit more information on what we did to get ready, and then I'll get into it. So we need to know, where is the money spent? I talked about that. So we need to know the region, what region is it in what locality, all the way down to the county level. We're able to talk about where the money landed. We need to know where, why, what was it spent on, what industry area, education, healthcare. I talked about that. Of course, that's not clean between the different data systems. And so there's a tremendous amount of work that needs to go into linking the way one group talks about it to another group and to another. And then we needed those estimates on where do the organizations spend the money. So we have all of that. I'm going to share just a little bit of that preliminary stuff. And then we use this input and output analysis across the 7 state regions. And that's about as wonky as I'm going to get for you right now today. And so we'll go ahead and take a look at some of the of where. So one nice thing to be able to think about is, like, where does the money go, and where is it across the 7 states? It reminds us about the 7-state region that's important to Philanthropy Southwest. So I know the table's a little small, but draw your attention to the fact that we estimate that there was about $11 billion in grant making during the 2021 when this data was gathered. Across all foundations that are in this region. It's still hard to get a solid number on this, so I do want to acknowledge the fact that that's probably even a low estimate of the philanthropic giving that's happening, but it's a pretty reasonable estimate of how much money is giving out. And then you can see where it goes, right? So roughly 50% of the giving is taking place in the state of Texas, 48% here. You can see that same number right here, which makes sense because the state of Texas represents about 54% of the population. And then it's fun with that, with knowing the population of a state and knowing an estimate of the roughly $5 billion that's given out by Texas foundations, you can make an estimate on per capita. That becomes a useful tool to then be able to make estimates about, well, how does it compare? Right? Folks in Texas super generous compared to everybody else in that kind of way. And again, I want to emphasize that it's not a complete or a measure of all giving. This is just what's happening with philanthropic foundations and foundation actors. Grant-making entities might be another way that we would refer to this. You can see some of the other numbers. I don't know if I want to. So let's see which state technically comes in as some of the most generous. Well, it looks like it's Arkansas, and we might also recognize that a fair amount of that's happening through some of the wealthiest individuals in the world happen to also live up in Arkansas. The Walton family is up there and has been tremendously generous and is a big part of some of that giving that's happening in that region and reflects some of that work. Colorado comes in second in regards to sort of it is per capita measure. I won't use the word generosity because that's not really fair, but it's a per capita measure on reference to regional variation. So we got a sense of how many people live there and roughly what percentage of the giving across the region lands in that state. And as I said, I'll try and unpack each one of these so that you can see them separately. The vast majority of the money tends to stay in state, except for the unique outlier of Nevada, which is really an interesting one, that the foundations in Nevada seem to send that money out. And one of the things we noticed, it doesn't actually happen to land in the other Southwest states. So our assumption, we didn't get a chance to fully unpack this and explore it out, is that the money might be going to California in that direction, as opposed to coming back toward Colorado or in the other direction or within the state. So you see that Nevada is just 20, and when we've talked to people in Nevada, and they reaffirm that that is indeed a practice that they see happening, that a fair amount. You can see these little tiny bits across the top. That's the international money. This is the non-Southwest money, so you can see how big that is there in reference to not one of the 7 states. And then the little blue in the middle is actually this one, this Southwest. So it's one of these other adjoining states. We can even take a look at Arkansas and say, well, where's that 10% going, and to what direction, or New Mexico, et cetera, like that. We won't get into that level of detail. And those are those same per capita numbers that you saw before, but I pulled them out onto one slide so that you can see them and where the money goes. One of the things we noticed right away, and I went ahead and did this little extra calculation, is that we were able to do some analysis to take a look at metro regions. And the way we talked about metro regions was a population of 1 million or more, and non-metro regions. So that was basically everybody else. So we looked at a state and we said, where's the general population region, a metro region? So in Texas, there's like 4 or 5 of these. And in Oklahoma, I think there's 2. And in New Mexico, there's barely 1, right? Because there's just 2 million people in New Mexico. But what's interesting is that we see this pattern pretty consistently, is that by and large, the metro regions tend to receive more money per capita than the non-metro regions. And you can see these disparities, or these differences, come up quite strongly in different states, and some are more pronounced than others. And so we'll look at it again within each state area. But this gives you a sense of where does the money go? It goes across the 7-state region at differing levels. It tends to land a little bit more in cities and metro areas than it does in non-metro areas. We also know where the money comes from or goes to in reference to its purposes. This actually comes off of the the dashboard that Mallory made reference to. It's a really useful resource. I probably should have given you that link. Maybe Alyssa, we could put that into the material that we use for follow-up, make sure people know where that dashboard is, because that's a nice thing. Patterns stay fairly consistent state by state, but a few to point out, right? Roughly 20% of the giving falls into this broad category of education, which is a very broad category. Healthcare as well is an incredibly broad category, accounting for about 15% of the giving, and another 17% goes toward general human services, or human interest area, human care, kind of human programming and those kinds of things. So you got a little bit of a sense, 5% toward the arts and culture, et cetera, et cetera. We won't, but knowing where this was, where the money, what's the purpose is, and generally where it lands, gives us 2 pieces of the information: how much of it and where does it go. It gives us we're almost there. We just need to know how does the entity that receives the money, how do they spend that money? And so those were those estimates that we were able to make in regards to that material. By and large, they're spending the money on programs. That doesn't mean that it wasn't also wages. I don't give you the wages calculation here, but we were able to make some estimates about roughly of any given dollar, roughly how much goes toward wage of grants dollars goes toward wages, how much goes toward. But this one's everybody's pretty familiar with, and one where we can gain some understanding and gives you a little bit of an insight roughly. Basically, they're reporting that they're spending their money on programmatically versus fundraising or management expense. And as I said, we had these calculations for wages as well, which is one of the other interesting things that we got. So with all that, we're able to make some of those estimates. So this is the number that Tony Fondaro, who's the ED of Philanthropy Southwest, had been waiting for, the one that does actually catch people's attention and gives them a handle on what is the economic impact of foundations across the Southwest region. So we saw that they give roughly $1 billion in giving during that year. and through the calculations of making estimates, another $14 billion in induced and indirect effect happens as a result of that. So economic foundations can talk about an overall impact of around $25 billion in the 7-state region, which is a good number. It's a solid number. It demonstrates some really power. It does attract people and help people understand those implications. One thing that we talked about and would be curious about would be regional comparisons. Is it the same across all of the 7-state region that we were looking at? And what we see is that no, the economic estimates, so this is the induced and the indirect expense in reference to, okay, so what happens across the region is roughly we see for every dollar of philanthropic giving, we see roughly another $1.28 of induced and indirect impact. But that's inconsistent, or it's not the same everywhere. Some of that has to do with the regional economy. Some of that has to do with the way that the money's spent. Some of it has to do with how the money was allocated in different areas. But a lot of it had to do with what's going on in the economies in those regions. So you see a pretty good return, if you will, in Arizona and Texas. It tends to be the ones that tend to drive a higher level of return. And again, I don't have full ability to be able to know exactly why that happens, but some of it, as I said, basically is the economies of those regions and how the money is allocated, where in certain areas we see a lower level of return. So for every dollar of philanthropic giving in New Mexico, we're seeing that lower level of return per dollar given. Let's take a look at employment, and then we'll switch to each state so that we can see some of these again. So I'll unpack these just a little bit more for you so that you can see them there. Hopefully I'm not going too fast. Somebody might let me know if I'm causing too much confusion. The jobs one is the other one that people want to be able to talk about. Roughly how many jobs does philanthropy support? Grants given to the state directly support an estimated 100,000 jobs across the 7-state region, resulting in probably an estimated 70 plus thousand jobs as a result of that, right? So one employment triggers and instigates subsequent employment and subsequent of other activities. So we saw that. So these are estimates about roughly, we're talking about 172,000 jobs in the region are supported through philanthropic work that's been done by foundations in the area. So those are pretty good numbers. Those are the ones that Tony is able to use and is able to talk about, and you can as well, right? When you start talking about how important philanthropy is for your region, and so some 7 states is a little hard. It doesn't mean much to a lot of people. In some ways, it's not all that important. I mean, for Philanthropy Southwest, it was a key number. Tony needed that for his ability to be able to talk about stuff. Tony and Mallory needed that for theirs. But most people really were much more curious about, well, what's happening in Phoenix, or what's happening in my state of Arizona, and what's going on there in regards to philanthropic giving that's going on. So you're going to see this pattern. So I'm going to go to the state, and then I'm going to give you about 3 slides on each one of them that allows you to be able to see what's going on in each one of those areas. So here's our overall number that we saw for Arizona. Roughly about $1 billion in giving is happening in Arizona with a population of a little over 7.5 million, right? So that was that per capita giving. And then is it distributed evenly across the state is basically what this question is asking here, either in relation to the population, which is what this number is trying to illustrate, or we can just simply look at the fact that roughly 67% of the population is in the Phoenix metro area, about 5 million people. You're looking at 63% of the giving is happening there. So it's fairly corollary. One of the areas where we see some differences is that there's only roughly 14% of the population is down in the Tucson metro area, but they happen to receive about 30% of the giving is allocated or earmarked in reference to going toward the Tucson region, resulting in a higher level per capita giving per individual living in that area. And then, as I noted before, then when you see the comparison, so for the rest of the state with about 18% 25% of the population, about 87 million in giving, resulting in a lower per capita estimate there to be able to make sense of what that table is trying to be able to tell you. So estimated how much is given, where is it, and then roughly how does that compare to the population? And is that, and you kind of get this sense of, oh, Tucson's doing all right in reference to the philanthropic. And we'll see this pattern, as I said. So make the same estimate about the economic impact overall in Arizona. This is a number that they can take to the state legislature, that they can talk about in their state as they try to help the legislatures understand the value of philanthropic actors in their state. They can say, well, we gave about a 1.1 billion, resulting in another $1.5 billion of economic impact for the state, around 2.6 billion for the state of Arizona. And as I said, those are variable across the different regions. We notice that in the metro areas, you see that higher return than you might see in some of the non-metro or rural areas that are happening outside the state. And that pattern, as I say, is pretty consistent time over time in regards to what's going on. Let's take a look at a couple more. I'm going to kind of roll through those, but it should allow us some time for conversation and discussion, and I'll do the best I can to try and answer some of your questions. We'll take a look at, so there's 7 states, so pardon me as I start to click through these and get us through some of the states so that you can see them, but you can see some of that similar pattern. So we talked about Arkansas was roughly $1 billion in giving. Yeah, it just so happens that Bentonville and Little Rock are here in this category. And so you do notice that with just 25% of the total population, there's 67% of the giving is happening in that region, resulting in, I think this is the highest per capita giving across all of the areas that we looked at. And again, if you could slice it even smaller, you could probably find more higher investment. National comparisons are also quite fascinating, where in San Francisco you can see tremendously high levels of philanthropic of giving versus the rest of Arkansas or something along that line, where you see that lower level of giving comparatively to what's happening in those sub areas. And again, the economic impact numbered again to be able to see what's going on there. Almost $2 billion of overall economic impact from the philanthropic actors in the region. And again, the variation that we've talked about overall, Arkansas, the Little Rock area, seeing that level of return, and the more outside the metro areas, I shouldn't call them rural, outside the metro areas, seeing a slightly lower level of return. We'll click through. Colorado is interesting because you don't actually see that disparity. We've talked to some people in Colorado, and they've given us that there's a fair amount of work that's been done apparently to think about how they allocate, or the foundation actors. I don't have the full explanation, but several people reference the fact that, oh yeah, this is something they have thought about and they are aware of, and they try to allocate consistently in thinking about it. Metro Colorado is a different kind of state in some ways than some of the others. Two, we've got secondary metro areas of residency. You've got some wealthy areas outside of the metro areas as well going on that would not have gotten picked up, right? Because we only limited ourselves to populations of about 1 million, and we couldn't find another concentrated metro area of about 1 million people to look at in Colorado. If we had more time, or if folks are curious, we could unpack that more in Colorado to say, well, where is it going and how is it going to those different places? We were trying to get this initial swath, but if people wanted to know more, Texas would be another one that would be kind of interesting to know more once we get there. So you see this more or less. I make one reference to it, right? 2 or 3 million people outside of the Denver metro area, about 3 million people in the Denver metro area, receiving about 48% of the giving. So it's interesting that this is a more stable number. There's that economic impact number again. seeing the two, about a $4 billion economic impact in the state of Colorado. And some of that variation, again, we don't see that quite as dominant as we see in some of the other states. This is the only one that functions that way. As we said, Nevada, not too surprisingly, most of the money lands up in the metro, in the Las Vegas metro area. That's where 73% of the population is there anyway. And so you can see some of those other giving patterns. And those same kinds of numbers, around 600 million in giving, roughly resulting in another $1 billion in economic impact or overall impact, another 400 million in induced and indirect, around $1 billion philanthropic aspect of their industries and regions across the state. New Mexico, we had a hard time finding 1 million people to be able to come up with a metro region in New Mexico. So it's actually it's much larger than Albuquerque. It actually stretches almost through the whole middle part of the state. We had to grab in Santa Fe to include in there. So it's not a really, I don't love, but we wanted to be able to have that analysis to be able to, because there's only a couple million people and actually living in the whole state of New Mexico. So anyhow, we've got a pretty big region. We went from Albuquerque all the way up to Santa Fe to find 1 million people to be able to talk about that. So this loses some of those variations that are so obvious in some of the other places that we might have talked about. And the overall economic impact, as you can see, New Mexico is not an incredibly wealthy state, but I mean, per capita wise, we're seeing some of that going on as well. There's a lot of money coming into New Mexico, which we didn't look at. So there's philanthropic dollars that come in from other places and that we didn't look at. We were just looking at the actors within the state and the work that's being done by those foundations within the state. So that's an important thing to remember, that there's additional money coming into the state from other places and that we didn't really look at. And it's not included in these calculations. Let's see if there's anything else here. So we got a couple more to go. So let me get through those so we can get to some questions. But I don't want to rush through anything. If anybody's here from Oklahoma, they get a few minutes to be able to take a look at that. As I said, these will be available to you. I'm always happy to be able to chat with folks too. If you need a little help talking it through or have questions, like I say, I'll give you a little bit afterwards. Here I can talk with folks, but you can see where the money's going in Oklahoma. It turns out it tends to land a little bit more in the Tulsa metro. And again, for those folks from the region, you would know better than I about why that is and who some of those actors are and what they're doing in those metro areas. The reports that are available that you can download, I'll show you where those are as well, have a little bit of mapping so you can actually see the counties that are included within each region. If you're curious about, well, what counties did you include in that in the Tulsa metro area, and you can actually see the counties, and we can even identify them in the full report. In the short report, you can see the picture that helps you to be able to identify that. Roughly a $2 billion economic impact in Oklahoma. And then that sort of return on investment, some variability within those areas. Oklahoma overall, Oklahoma City, Tulsa, and the west of Oklahoma. And these are just those induced impacts. So you got your original dollar results in these kinds of returns. Texas, I think this will be our last, I think this is our last state. I'm getting my way through. Obviously, we said it's the most populous state in the seven of the seven. So we've had several metro areas that we were able to take a look at, and it's kind of interesting to be able to see what's going on. Folks familiar with Texas know that roughly 25% of our population is in this Houston metro area. Roughly another 25% is in that Dallas metro area, both of which are seeing giving around 30% of the total for the state. So they're fairly, and you can see that reflects in this calculation here roughly consistently. So the only sort of outlier, if you will, is that Austin, with we're about 8% of the population, 2.5 million people, those entities tend to be receiving a slightly well, it's it's a little over twice what some happening in some of these other regions. And there again, we'd have to really unpack it to fully know exactly where it's going and who's getting it. Large gifts obviously make a huge difference sometimes. So sometimes that can be thrown off by really large gifts that might happen or land in. And of course, Austin has recently picked up a very large foundation, which is now the largest one in the state. I'm not saying that's being influenced there, but it's potential in reference to what's going on. San Antonio, and certainly would be something worth watching as the largest foundation in the state now is located in the Austin metro region. Overall giving, you can see a pretty substantial number here, $13 billion of philanthropic as the economic impact of philanthropic giving in the state of Texas. And there's those variabilities for the different regions within the state. Overall, Austin, Dallas, Houston, San Antonio, and then the rest of Texas. So you see that sort of rural or non-metro area kind of effect that happens there with some of this. You know, like all of these economic numbers are just one measure of the work of foundations. I'll be calling on Mallory too. We can talk about what we're trying to do on some of the other things because we realize this is just one number. It's a nice solid number. It gives you really something to be able to talk about, and you can take to people who are less familiar with the sector and just simply say we're important. It's a $25 billion impact to the region, supports 170,000 jobs. For every dollar philanthropic, it generates another $1.28. Average giving across the Southwest is almost $200. Money does tend to stay in the state. We do see variability about the economic returns, but mostly organizations are spending or reporting that they're spending their money on programs. 83% of their funds are toward programs. Let's see. If you're curious about the reports, as I say, we can send you those to take a look at. If you've got a minute, you can take a picture of that. I don't know exactly. I never can quite figure out. But if you hold your camera up, you can get to the place where you can download the reports. So every state has one as well as the region. So you're welcome to be able to take a look at those. But maybe I should, let's see. Let me get through these. Oh, a couple more things. For the granting entities or the foundations that are online, we're offering through our partnership with Philanthropy Southwest for a limited time. We're able to give individualized reports. So we're working with a couple of foundations to be able to prepare an individualized report for foundations and their allocation patterns. If you're curious about, well, what's my economic impact as a foundation, we can actually make some of those estimates for you. And that's what this is here. And right now we're offering that for, like I say, sorry, I don't mean to sound like I'm doing an ad, for a limited time. But really we don't have too much more time, and we can get this done and we can generate those reports. At this point, we're doing it as a service for our partnership with Philanthropy Southwest. We do other things at the center, and so if you're curious about research work that we do, we're happy to talk with you a little bit about that. And I want to make sure you know about some upcoming stuff. Our continuing education starts in February, and we'll have webinars. Many of you track and keep track of these webinars, and then we're working on a introductory webinar to talk about system change. That's the paper that Wynn Rosser and I had done. Mallory, insights, anything you want to add that as I rolled through all that, anything I was particularly unclear about that are too fast?
It's a lot of information for a lunchtime webinar. We know
I'm
that,
sorry.
But this was sort of one of our many attempts to share this information with our population. We've taken Dr. Brown with us for the past 2 years at our PSW on the Road events, where he's shared this information as it's been broken down by state and region. So these were just our questions, that we established with Dr. Brown and his team, but we are open if there's others on the call who, looking at this would say, man, I wish you would have thought of that or included this. Let us know what that is that you are interested in knowing and learning, because we're happy to go through more iterations and we might just pick your topic.
I haven't been able to check check the chat. I don't know, Alyssa, if there was anything that came through there that was a specific, any questions that came through as we were going along that I could start with, or if folks have other questions, feel free to raise your hand. I can call on you.
We did have one question about New Mexico. It might have been answered, but Patricia was wondering if there's any comments on why New Mexico is the way it is and it's such an outlier.
Mallory, have you got better insights into what's going on in New Mexico? I made one reference to the fact that there's a fair amount of money coming into the state from outside of that, and that's not picked up there.
That's what we saw actually with a couple states. That's also true was that true with Nevada, or was the opposite? More money was leaving
Opposite
Nevada.
true with Nevada. There's a lot of money was going out.
So the point of the study was to really look at the economic impact within the state. And so if we weren't able to dig deep enough, I think that's why we would just assume there's something that's outlying in New Mexico. I'm actually based in El Paso, and have worked previously in New Mexico for about a decade. And I think it's okay for me to say New Mexico is just its own state that does things differently. And we just weren't able to dig much deeper into that. But we're interested if there's anyone with New Mexico.
Pat, you always have insights on some of this stuff.
Yeah.
I'm sure you asked the question with probably a little bit of thinking about what it might be. So if you had insights, I'd be curious to hear that as well.
I really don't know much about New Mexico.
Okay.
And it seems to be politically a bit aberrant too, in terms of, if you just think of the relationship between philanthropy and politics. I don't know. That's why I was curious. The other question I have is, this is a really interesting analysis that you're doing for the Southwest regions. Are others doing this as well, so that we get a national picture, a national comparison of some kind?
Mallory, do you know of it? Because you've got counterparts across the country, of course.
Thank you for that beautiful setup, Pat. No one else is doing this. We are the only ones really digging into this and being so good at sharing all this information. No, we actually haven't found anybody else digging into the data this way. We also asked Candid, our data partner, if they, because we had to ask for specialized reports for this, and they didn't say that they had done these for this purpose elsewhere. So we haven't seen anything, but if you do, please share it with us.
Yeah, I don't know, but it would be interesting to know that.
I mean, one thing I have seen, right, is that part of how this started is we did some of this economic impact of the nonprofit sector for the state of Texas. So we did that for the Build for Texas report. I've seen similar things done in California. We did something similar for the group in Louisiana. So the nonprofit sector has done things, typically at the state level, to talk about, well, for a similar kind of reason, to be able to say we're important, and one way you can think about us being important is our economic impact. So sorry, Pat, what were you thinking?
I'm not familiar with the software that you're using, but does it allow you to model other variables that might be explanatory for these
Yes,
findings?
there are ways to be able to try and unpack it more. Given where we were at, I wasn't able to get into it in that level of detail. It would take a little bit more doing for me to try and be able to. It's pretty sophisticated. It's Implan is the name of the group, and they do these kinds of reports for all different kinds, right? So you've seen economic impact reports for all different kinds of things. This was the first time they had done one quite in this philanthropic space, so it was a little bit of jimmying to get all of these things to fit into the categories that were primarily industry based. So there was some of that concern as well. But yeah, they have a couple of different ways of being able to unpack some of it. Yeah, it would take a little more doing.
What I'm thinking about is is, you know, if there are holes, you know, we're looking at New Mexico, for example, as an outlier. And so, and you're saying there's outside money coming in. So what are the alternatives to philanthropy that you're competing with? You know, in other words, okay, what institutions come in and deal with, since most of the money is going to programs based on the data, the programs are probably focused on a certain set of problems. What are those problems? And what other institutions might be substituting for philanthropic dollars in the solution of those problems? Thinking about it as alternative logics or alternative institutions that are coming in. You know, in other words, is the state, you know, what kind of money is the state itself putting in, spending of taxpayer dollars versus private philanthropy? Or, you know, what money is coming from the churches, for example? In other words, thinking of the logic of religion or the logic of the state as alternative sets of institutions that provide programs. Getting us, you know, that's what I'm wondering.
I've seen a little bit of stuff on industries, so like maybe hospitals or maybe that look at patterns of revenue basically within these different industries. You know, so how much is, and philanthropic action ends up being a relatively modest element for a lot of these actors. And so the state plays a pretty dominant role. Fee-based elements play a pretty dominant role. Somebody's question just came up in reference to small versus large nonprofit organizations, and you would see variation there as well. And then I just recently saw some work in reference to comparisons of you know, social services and the way that those are being funded. Primarily, I think that analysis was looking at the public money, how much of public money was going in. It would be fascinating though to unpack it and look at philanthropic versus public money versus, and then, yeah, and then you could even look at behavior, right? It would be fascinating to look at the behavior of the organizations in some capacity. I'm not quite sure how we would even go about that.
I'd love a comparison of public, you know, versus private dollars. And one of the things that you mentioned about Arkansas that was interesting is fundamentally entrepreneurship, providing, you know, the Walton family, for example. In other words, certain kingpin Dell, you know,
right.
Walmart, certain kingpin enterprises that have been started, Oklahoma, thinking about Hobby Lobby, certain kingpin enterprises that have been started by you know, entrepreneurs that are having a social entrepreneurship impact in a way. In other words, it's.
I mean, you think about the two large, some of the largest foundations in the state of Texas, is the Arnold Foundation, right, which is the money that came out of Enron, and then the Musk Foundation is, of course, the largest foundation in the state with over, it was something, I think I just saw the number, around $25 billion in assets that the Musk Foundation has. So they're massive, you know, and of course then you look at some of the other entrepreneurial oriented individuals in their framing, and yeah, it would be an interesting slice, right? Because there's the for lack of a better phrase, you know, some of the older money maybe that comes from oil or some of the other things that are happening in the state of Texas, and then some more of the Dell, you gave reference to Dell as well, would be another interesting slice on this.
I think it has really policy implications in the sense of for the state looking for alternatives to fund grand challenges and programmatic activity besides taxpayer dollars, what can be very effective.
Other questions folks have that they want to jump in here and try and engage on some of this, or anything else I can clarify? Because Pat and I could go for quite a while.
I know, I think what you're doing is really interesting, which is why I'm in France right now, which is why I tuned in.
I appreciate it. I appreciate it. Pat's a faculty member here at at A&M and has done tremendous work for a number of years and has been engaged in our entrepreneurship work. That was a part of her question as well. I don't mean to cut folks short, but Mallory, is there more that you want to be able to do?
I don't have anything to add, no.
There was a question in the chat just about the February 2025 event that y'all are doing, Mallory.
Oh,
I think they just wanted to know more about it, and it was Heidi's question. They wanted to know if
Okay.
it's open to staff of nonprofits.
It's not. We're a funder-based organization, so it's open to members and non-members of PSW, but you have to be a funder. So community foundations and health foundations and all the verticals within the community and health foundation organization. So grant officers, program officers, CFOs, trustees, and anyone like that, but associated within the community or health foundation.
I mean, hats off. I mean, I'll say it here too. I really appreciate that you guys asked the question, that you were able to come up and support this work. That was Tony Fundora was sort of the new ED, and they came in and as Mallory said, it was a relatively new venture for Philanthropy Southwest as well. And so I do really appreciate that you're asking these questions in a way that you're trying to approach some of this work. So I want to
Very happy
acknowledge that.
to. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, then maybe I'll give folks back a couple of minutes unless they want to have a little bit more. I certainly talked enough. Appreciate you. Feel free to follow up. Alyssa will definitely send out some material to make sure that you get what you need. And there, as she mentioned, there's a recording for those of you who want to hear it again. No, to share with friends. So and please do take a look at those reports. They're quite useful. Jeffrey, good to see you, sir.
Good to see you all as well. Thanks for presenting today.
Thank you. Take care.
Haley, good to see you.